I might have found more evidence that Lugia was right around Gen 1's time before it was created. But what's really strange is there's a lot of lost history with like some of the timeline events. And I actually was thinking about like when the first movies were ever released. Like you had like Mewtwo Strikes Back, well maybe not like that, but it was like the Pokemon the first movie. Then you also had like Pokemon the movie 2000, but they came out in Japan like a year earlier. And and here's where it gets interesting. The first version of Pokemon was released back in 1995. According to Satoshi Tajiri, when they created Pokemon for the first 6 years from like 1989 to 1995, in that era, there was 300 Pokemon concept arts that they had already developed. Now, most of them we're still trying to find, or some of them we're still trying to find. But I've always been concerned that maybe one of them was Lugia, considering the fact that they had to have had the idea longer than they went into production. Now, here's where it kind of gets really interesting. If you try to think about it mathematically, and you got to really figure. Some of the Pokemon movies kind of took roughly like maybe like a year to 2 years to design before they were initially released to the public. Now, as far as Pokemon, the first movie went, Pokemon, the first movie was released right around the same time when Pokemon was starting to come out, but in Japan it was already out for like 2 years. But what happened was when they actually got done with the first movie with Mewtwo, they actually started immediately doing productions with Lugia. And they stated that when they started making that movie, that because the first movie brought in a lot of money for the company, they said to basically the production team that you can basically do whatever you want with the character concept Lugia. But they always had this idea that it was called Pokemon X or something like that. And basically, so they didn't really want to reveal it to the public yet because they wanted to save it for like something else. Because you know how Game Freak can be, you know, they always want to like promote their things. Nintendo sort of does the same thing. I think that's how they usually do it. Japan's, it's just like one of their business mottos, I guess. Kind of get people excited about it. But what happened was, I always wanted to say that Lugia was part of Gen 1, even though it wasn't in Gen 1, because it had to have been designed right around that time. Lugia was a Pokemon that, it has a lot of lost history, and I mean, we can make other videos about it, but like, I'll kind of give it to you in a nutshell. Some of the concept arts of Lugia was actually supposed to be female, and it actually wasn't actually supposed to be like a male, even though it's a genderless Pokemon, but it kind of does look like more of a male than it does, you know, female. As of right now, at least. What I think is really strange, though, what's really even stranger is the fact that when you really think about like how long they might have had the idea before they released it to the public, because keep in mind, over in Japan, Lugia came out in 1999-ish, I think. Again, the Pokemon movie 2000 came out before it was aired over here. And but what I find really interesting though is even if you go dig back to like the 1997 Space World demo of like Pokemon Gold and Silver, 1997, yeah, it was you basically didn't find Lugia in that game. As a matter of fact, a lot of those Pokemon were moved over to Gen 4. Some of them weren't. Some of them were scrapped. Some of them might have been redesigned into something else, or maybe it was just something that they're holding on to right now. I wouldn't be surprised. I think a lot of Gen 2 Pokemon, the more I think about it, like there was a couple Cursed I was thinking of, might have been reworked into Gen 3's, Pokemon. Because again, if you really think about like if you think about like the repetition and all that and the Pokemon species and all that, they did rework everything into something else eventually. So I think that's a good way to compare it. And that's proof right there. But as far as Lugia goes, I do think that they had the concept from Gen 1 because if some of these movies did take a while to develop, it might make sense when and how long it took them to do it because they were probably constantly working on it, but because of the animations they were using. And I mean, I do remember the movies from start to finish. I haven't seen them all in a long time, but I do remember that the movies did take a little bit longer to make because there was a lot more details they were putting into it compared to like the actual animation of like say the anime, for example. And not just the runtime, but the details they were also using. I don't know if anybody has ever seen it, but they actually did state how they did Japanese animation at the time, and they actually did state how they did like an episode of Pokemon, even if people don't watch the anime. They did show like specifically how they did it. So it did take some time. So if the production actually was released in 1999, the finalization of it, then we can assume that it was released, they started the idea and they must have had the idea even before the demos were even created. Because how many Pokemon did they roughly have, even before Gen 1, that were never actually created, that were never in the final version, but then they later moved them on? Because eventually Lugia did actually end up making it into Gen 1. I mean, because you really think about it, what kind of Pokemon was Lugia? Lugia was a guardian of the sea, that we know it as. It was actually also supposed to be a Pokemon, and get this, its Pokemon powers were actually supposed to be like a millennial force, not millennial, but material force of some kind that was for Earth, not just for like Pokemon alike. It was supposed to be a lot more powerful than it originally was. So I kind of understand. So again, like I said before, like if anybody remembers, any follows this channel, we know that Lugia has always had like mystical powers that we don't see. Kind of like how Ho-Oh has the ability to bring people back to life and all that, and it had its concept. Kind of makes us wonder what their powers really do deep. Well, okay, so anyways, we also had reason to believe that when Pokemon Gen 1 was released, they had a lot of concept arts that they didn't use, whether prototype maps, a lot of Pokemon designs that weren't used. Again, 300-something Pokemon. But what's really strange is even Satoshi Tajiri stated that a lot of those Pokemon were eventually moved over to another generation. So they had the ideas a lot sooner, but I'm thinking like, they must have had the idea for Ho-Oh being like the sub-guardian of like Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. Because if you don't know the story, those three Pokemon were brought back to life when Ho-Oh showed up. It resurrected them. Lugia, they had to have had like the concept of what Lugia was at the time. Granted, yeah, there might have been some changes here and there, but its location, it was still known as the Twin Galaxy. Not Twin Galaxy, but it was the Twin Tower Galaxy with, legendary with Ho-Oh, the opposite. But the story went that the brass tower that Lugia used to live at burned down. Lugia flew southwest of the Johto region. Genkano is Gen 1, and Johto is 2. You see a lot of similarities in Gen 1 and 2. So with that being said, and as far as like sequels go and prequels go in Pokemon, Pokemon Gen 1 and 2 are probably the closest to each other than like Gen 5 is with its sequel, for example, like as far as Pokemon sequels go. And, so basically, those games have a lot more to do with each other than the other games do. So I wouldn't be surprised that Lugia and all them was a continuation of said thing. Because again, if they had these ideas of who these legendaries were supposed to be, then it's interesting to think like where they would have had these ideas coming from, and how far back they would have had these ideas before they utilized them. I think it's possible that, I don't think it's also possible, but I think it makes a lot more sense to say that Lugia would have been a Pokemon that would have been there from the very beginning, but they just didn't use it until they wanted to. Because again, the creators of Lugia stated that they wanted to save it for like a later on purpose, and later on Lugia did end up getting introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver. I mean, Lugia was eventually, like its name suggested, it was the guardian of the seas, and it had the mystical powers of being able to calm storms down. Later on, we'd have other legendaries that would kind of have similar powers, but like on a much larger scale. Like, for example, Rayquaza's airlock ability, where it could basically nullify any weather pattern. So who's technically stronger, Lugia or Rayquaza, right? I mean, Rayquaza's a pretty useful, when you really think about it, it's got its own godlike powers, and so does Lugia. As far as I'd actually argue maybe Rayquaza actually has more psychic powers than Lugia does, because like Rayquaza can literally sleeping. We see it in Pokemon Emerald. Like, you go to Rayquaza's tower when the weather patterns are out of control, and then all of a sudden you get to the top, and then you find out that Rayquaza awakens because there's a disturbance in the atmosphere, and so therefore it knows exactly where it must go and what it has to do. So as if it is like it's a god that has like mystical powers basically. And Rayquaza is not easy to catch either, even though if you have the right Pokemon, it's a lot easier though. But same thing with Lugia. You had to go to the Whirlpool Islands, and I always try to remember where that puzzle was. It was like, what was it, the top right one was the answer out of the 4. But yeah, you eventually go in there, and I mean, if you had the Silver Wing, you'd eventually find Lugia just like hanging out in one of the caverns. Kind of makes me wonder how Lugia always got in and out of its cavern, though. Probably some underground passage, or some underwater passage. Like with cave erosions and whatnot. But so you'd get in there, and then eventually you'd find out that Lugia was, it was a flying and a psychic type, but they balanced it out because they didn't want Lugia being more powerful than Ho-Oh or vice versa. So that's why Lugia was always a never a true water type, even though it learned a lot of water type moves. I mean, it is what it is. There's contradictions left and right, but it's still a series that I love, though. But yeah, I do think that they must have had the idea for a long time, because it does make a lot of sense to think that they had a lot of lost history. Lugia would have been, if Lugia wasn't around for as long as it has been, there's reasons to believe that they wouldn't have had as much detail in the time period that they did. They must have had the idea for a long period of time, basically. And the earliest that we know it as was the release of Gold and Silver, but if it wasn't in any of the Space World demos, if it wasn't in the, because there were tons of Pokemon that were scrapped from those demos that were never used, and maybe they had the ideas at the time, they just weren't programmed into the final version. They might have made it past like the beta, alpha stage, but they weren't in the final version, at least not until a while later. Because keep in mind, as far as Gen 1 games go, Gen 1 and 2, they could only put like 255 Pokemon, as far as we know, without additional hacking somehow. And that, I'm not really sure how they would have done that, but they already, like, if it wasn't for like Satoru Iwata, when he came along, he actually wrote a compression algorithm that actually made Pokemon Gold and Silver be a lot more different than the original final version of like the 1997 Space World demo. That's why the game got a complete overhaul, because this guy they were able to create a lot more in that game, instead of them just having to do what they had, and then they just went back and re-released it. So that was actually pretty cool how Satoru Iwata actually was able to do that for them, and therefore they were able to go back and like add the Kanto region and whatnot, like 3 years after the final version of the games. And what we got instead was completely different compared to the originals. So like some of the Pokemon I know they took out, like I know they took Leafeon out, but they still use Leafeon in Gen 4. They held on to the idea, they just took it out of Gen 2, and it wasn't in Gen 3, but they moved it to Gen 4, and therefore we got it when we did. Who knows how many more Pokemon they would have put in Gen 4 or Gen 3, but we still know that there was supposed to be a 411 rather than the 386 that we got. So they held on to a lot of ideas. They just probably didn't know what to do with them at first. So, but it is interesting trying to figure it out, though, because like Lugia was always one of my favorite legendaries until recent years. Then it started changing. I think it was like Tapu Lele was one of my favorites, because like you could because type advantages and all that. Like once fairy types were introduced in Gen 6, it like competitive play made in a lot of ways it changed a lot of things. And some of the legendaries, or even like Necrozoma, for example, its dragon form was really cool. It's light form. Let me rephrase that. I was always impressed with how some of the things they came out with. It was just really cool. Like, Pokemon, like we're going to other planets now. We're seeing like Pokemon from other planets. Like, we've always had like Pokemon like Starmie and all that. They would come from like other planets. They'd crash land on Earth, and then like they were aliens from other planets basically. And then when Gen 3 came out, you had Solrock and Lunatone and all that. And they were meteorite Pokemon, which were also really cool. But their origins were always surrounded in mystery, because like no matter how many scientists in the games were like discovering them, they were still baffled at how many things they didn't know about like their Pokemon powers. Like one of my favorites was like Solrock and Lunatone. They basically were like solar power asteroids, basically. Like they would use, you know, hence the energy of like whether it was the moon or the sun. Soul Rock would obviously use the sun's power, and then the Soul Rock, and then Lunatone would use like the moon's power, and then therefore it was able to levitate, it was able to stay awake, it was able to basically do what it did because it was generating stuff out of the universe, you know. And that was pretty clever. That was actually pretty clever how they wrote it like that. You also had, what was it? What was the other one? Who was the other one? And you know, and it kind of makes me think like what Lugia was, you know, like all legendaries seem to have like mystical psychic powers or supernatural powers. But it does make me think like what more powers do they have that we have yet to uncover? Like Lugia was always a design choice that they had ever since the beginning, but they didn't utilize it until years later is basically what I'm thinking. Because when you're a designer of something, there has to be some kind of modification somewhere down the line. You have to have these concept arts like way ahead of time before you finalize them, and then that's when people, because again, when you are a fan of a series, you're only seeing the final results they have. You're not really seeing like everything they went through, everything they put in towards the games. It just makes us really think what we have yet to uncover that would actually be in the final versions of said games, or even like the development history. And I really do think that if we ever get a chance to like interview some of the game designers again, I think we really should ask them some of these questions. Like, you know, how many concept designs have they really scrapped that we haven't really got a chance to really figure out? Like, you know, how many total Pokemon must they have had before they finally released them? I just think it's really cool, like how many ideas went into this series and how many actually made it out, and even the ones that were final, like how many ideas, like how far back some of these ideas go before they finally reused them into something else, you know. So I do still believe that that is proof that, because, you know, and here's something else that's even more bizarre to think about. If you really think about all the Pokemon in Gen 1 that we've discussed so far, they were eventually recycled into Gen 2 and further on. Except there were some of them that they weren't like recycled, they were just moved straight up to like the next generation, like Lugia, for example. Like, and here's where it gets even more bizarre. There was a guy on YouTube, or a woman, I don't know if it was a man or a female, male or female, that uploaded a bunch of videos on one of the Pokemon. They were trading like all the missing no data into Gen 2. And they were forcing it to actually work. Now, here's where it gets strange. As far as what Missing No was a real Pokemon. It was just a placeholder, but the data was kind of moved around a little bit. So that's why it kind of looked corrupted, because the sprite animation and all that was still in the games, was kind of removed, but like the coding existing towards it was still there. So some of the Pokemon, while they might have been different at one point, because like when Gen 1 came out, there was roughly 191 Pokemon that they agreed on, but they lowered it to 151. So what ended up happening was 40 of those Pokemon got scrapped, and we kind of know what those Pokemon are. Some of them are still missing, sure, but you know, but we have an idea that the Pokemon that were eventually changed were eventually moved to Gen 2. And some of the Gen 2 Pokemon that were in the final version of Gen 2, believe it or not, weren't actually in Gen 1, but they might have been in the final version. They should have been planned for Gen 1. And some of the Pokemon that, one of the very few that weren't actually like replaced by something else that was actually like a beta of Gen 1 that I couldn't find, was like Lugia, Ho-Oh, like, because again, you had like the missing no data, and it was like a second group in the final version of Gen 2 that you could trade over from Gen 1 to Gen 2, and it would turn into that Pokemon. Like Lugia was one of those Pokemon. So my question is, why would it turn into those Pokemon specifically? And if some of the beta Pokemon that were actually in the Pokemon first, before Gen 2 Pokemon were being able to trade from Gen 1 to Gen 2 based on their corrupted data, that tells me that some of those Pokemon must have been planned for Gen 1 at some point, because they're intertwining with some of the data that was actually found in Gen 1. So they had to have been it must have been that concept art. See, it does get confusing, but that's literally what it is, though. Some of those Pokemon were originally supposed to be programmed even further back than, let's say, they initially were. And I think that makes a lot of sense to say why like Lugia wasn't really in Gen 1, because it wasn't at the time. That's not,
because Gen 1, what was Gen 1? Gen 1 was the story of Red, Green, and how they were going on their adventure at the time. But the Johto region did exist, though. It's just we never saw it until later on, though. So 3 years would pass, and then you'd play as Gold, and then, 3 years, whatever happened in that time period was going on. And that's when we know that Lugia existed, for example, and Ho-Oh. But there were still a lot of other mysteries that had happened in between times, or even way before, that we never got a chance to see, but might have passed, but its lore was there because it was the Pokemon universe. And so because of that, we know for a fact that, Red would go off to be like one of the greatest trainers of all time. And, there's no doubt in my mind that even Red could, like, if Red ever ran into Lugia, for example, he could probably catch, Lugia with the Pokemon he had, because, he's been around for so long. But what was really interesting was, Pokemon like Lugia and Pokemon like, the sub-legendaries like Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno, for example, if they were there since the very beginning, then that had to have been more proof that if Lugia's data was initially found in like Gen 1 at some point, or even eventually moved over to Gen 2, because that's where it eventually was found, that makes a lot of sense why Gen 1 was a sequel to Gen 1 and 2 had a lot to do with each other, because they probably initially planned that Gen 1 and Gen 2 should have been a little bit longer, but they probably were, because like Satoshi Tajiri stated, they had a lot of ideas for Gen 1, and that's why they decided to make a sequel, because at that time they wanted to use the rest of that data one way or another. And if they couldn't put it in the first game, because again, cartridge limitations, they'd find a way to do it in the second game. And I believe that's why they went back and redid everything, even the best they could. And even there were some things they had to scrap too, because, they obviously were planning more ideas too. But, they still made it work somehow, So Gen 2 eventually found its way, and eventually we got all the Pokemon that we did. And while some Pokemon were eventually reworked into something else, and we had no idea at the time, because there was nothing to really compare it to, eventually, it does make sense that that's why Lugia was eventually used in Generation 2. But it's just amazing how many ideas they must have had, the way they wanted to introduce it, not just for business reasons too, but at the same time, though, they really wanted to keep people interested in what they were doing somehow. Here's a legendary Pokemon that wasn't, and I do believe that. I think that ultimately was why at first they didn't want to put Lugia in Gen 2, not until the final version of Gen 2, because as far as the Pokemon prototype data goes, they were still working on those games. So that's why Lugia wasn't in those games yet, because they didn't release the games yet. But they finally realized, hey, we'll release Pokemon the movie 2000 just before, but we'll release the games too. And then once they put him in English, obviously Lugia was the mascot for Pokemon Silver, and Ho-Oh was the legendary for Pokemon Gold. And then once they released Pokemon Crystal, they basically released both versions. And so it was a more updated version of Gen 2. So it kind of makes sense why they did what they did. And it is interesting how the lost history I was able to find so far. So this will be rather interesting. I think that Lugia was actually supposed to be originally a female, and then there were some Pokemon trainers that were actually supposed to be different as well. But man, it's just interesting how much history is different with the series, and how much stuff we didn't see in the prototype. Like, still makes me wonder, like, even though if it wasn't in the final version, it didn't happen, but it does make me think, like, why they changed it, what made them want to change it over other ideas, or ultimately where we go from there. Because, like, even in the prototype, one of the coolest things I thought was really interesting is there was a battle between, like, Gold and Blue, and he wasn't originally the champion, but he was a lot stronger though than he was in the final version. But I think what happened was they took that version and they changed it because Blue wasn't just a researcher, didn't go back to just being a researcher for his grandfather, again Professor Oak in this case. Professor Oak was still in the final version of Gen 2, obviously, even in the prototype. But at the same time, though, I do believe that it kind of would have contradicted maybe his behavior, rather, or maybe not. Maybe he might have grew up a little bit, because we know Green and Blue, depending on what version you want to go off of, but we'll go with Green because he was originally, that's what his Japanese name was. he was originally trying to figure out, like, what he was going to do next. He was already the Kanto champion. Red came along, took it from him. But after that, Red was just, you couldn't beat him. Like, I mean, he was just too damn strong for the most part. Like, he at that point, Red just made up his mind, like, what he wanted out of life. And, he wasn't going to stop until he had it. Maybe when he first started out, he was a novice trainer. He didn't know what he wanted to do. Like, if we're going based on, like, he lost the first battle with his rival. But after he met up with him again, it was a completely different story, because he just didn't, he didn't even come close to beating him. I mean, if we're not talking about, like, Origins history, because they kind of had to balance it out a little bit more. But as far as, like, Red goes, like, as a trainer, Red was way stronger than Blue. It's just a debatable question, like, at what point did Red become the trainer, the confidence he had? And most people just, either you get out of his way or you're just going to get steamrolled by him, because that's basically, like, what had happened with the series. Some Pokemon trainers were just, they made up their minds like that. That's who they wanted to be, and and for the very first trainer that we were introduced to in the series, I mean, that's a hell of an accomplishment, no joke. So yeah, Lugia, I do believe that, along with a lot of other concepts, they probably changed a lot of it because they were moving stuff around, but at the same time, though, I think they did still end up using it the way they wanted to. Lugia was still the guardian of the sea, and still a lot of mystery surrounding Lugia. I think that's really what they were after. So I don't think they screwed that up. But I do think that Lugia definitely is basically a god, basically. I do think Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno, Articuno and Zapdos would probably be the easier ones to take Lugia out. Moltres is obviously a sitting duck because it's a fire type. But I do think Lugia was way stronger than all three of them. That's why the Sub-Guardians always watched over him. Because they... Like, especially if you like the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, I like what they did, because they kind of captured, like, the 3 islands that were kind of based on the movie 2000, where, like, Lugia would be sleeping somewhere else, and then, they had the 3 islands that were, like, you had to go get those orbs and all that actually, and bring them back, and then you had to summon Lugia. It was like, that's how they did it, you had to pass a bunch of trials first in order to... But the orbs were guarded by the legendary birds, right? And they were not easy to get past, so... I think that was pretty cool how they did that, but but anyways, what else do I say? If you're not subscribed already, please subscribe. We'll be making more videos. But yeah, there's a lot of lost history with Lugia. I'm still digging into a lot of it. There's actually a story about, like, how someone almost drove someone to their suicide or something like that because they didn't get what they wanted. Like, a lot of obsession over it. I'll have to dig into it. There's a lot of lore that people just really fall in love with their work, and maybe they just didn't see it going the way they wanted to. So, but yeah, Lugia is an interesting Pokemon. Definitely does make me still think, like, they are the tower legendaries between Ho-Oh and Lugia, but it's still, even that story, no matter how many times I go back to it, like, there's so many things about it still that we don't know. Like, what did the Brass Tower originally look like before it burned down? And, as far as the Pokemon that Ho-Oh saved, and then we had Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, for example, what about that? What about the people Ho-Oh saved? Was Ho-Oh saving them from Arxaris? When, because Arxaris actually used to, because here's where it gets kind of disturbing a little bit. Arxaris is the creator of the legendaries, right? So Arxaris uses all sorts of things to be able to create in its own image because it's the god of all Pokemon, basically. But as far as Pokemon goes, it's been confirmed that even Arxaris isn't necessarily the very beginning. Maybe as far as, the Pokemon universe goes, but Arxaris even had parents too. It states that it came from an egg somewhere and it formed the existing universe that we know of. But it does state, though, that Arxaris did have parents originally. So it's like, well, if Pokemon itself is infinite, and there's a lot of stuff that obviously, can write itself, where is, its parents would come from a higher dimension, obviously, but it does make me think, though, not only who its parents are, but it does make you think, like, the supernatural powers it possesses that it holds back all the time. You know, like for example, Arcturus forms a lot of things with its 1,000 arms that we never see in mythology. But there's also the idea that it used the unknowns to be able to use the power. Because, like, you know, what did the Dexter entries say? The unknowns were mysteries. You know, they weren't just a bunch of flying letters and all that in the Ruins of Elf. The Ruins of Elf also was supposed to be like souls of like lost Pokemon. And they kind of did the same thing in the third Pokemon movie. That's kind of like how Entei came to be, sort of. The guy that was in Entei's form, he was eventually transformed into the legendary Pokemon Entei. But Ho-Oh, I don't think Ho-Oh saved him. But like in the mythology though, like Ho-Oh saved a bunch of Pokemon, a bunch of people's souls that were lost in some kind of torture of purgatory, but maybe Arcturus was like using their powers as energy. You know what I mean? Kind of makes you wonder what, like, you know, like the power of creationism, and then it's like it does make you think, like, what is the creator really thinking? Like, what goes on in its eyes that it sees us as? You know, like Arcturus, you know. The origins of the Sinnoh region, for example, like the Mount Olympus and all that, Zeus, and or like Midrid, if you want to get in like Norse mythology, again, like all sorts of different plantations of like just development and all that, you know. So there's so much we don't know about Pokemon that has yet to still be discussed and talked about, and we're still like uncovering all the secrets as we go along. So it does make me think though, but I do think that Lugia as a legendary is still no match for like some of the other legendaries. Like there are some Pokemon that are way stronger than Lugia, even if Lugia's powers are limited in some capacity, let's say. But I do think though that as time goes on, we will eventually figure that out, what those are, who they are, and where they represent. You know, so I think that's what makes Pokemon what it is. You know, as a series, it's always about, like, not just the fear of the unknown, but the adventure. It's always the sense of going out there, not knowing where everything's at, being able to find it, you know. And I think that's what makes great for Pokemon ROM hacks. You know, like some of the Pokemon are in there, but you don't know where they're at, and until you find them, you have to keep looking for them. So, you know, it does make you feel like that adventure, you know. And I think that's why Pokemon has survived all these years, because a lot of people got into it, and a lot of people just couldn't stop playing it because of that reason. So that's why a lot of people were building up the hype that they were, and it eventually surpassed a lot of other things at the time, you know. That's why a lot of people just can't stop playing it for the most part. It's always about some kind of field of exploration versus like just, you know, psychological terror of the unknown. But anyways, yeah. So Lugia is an interesting Pokemon, but so is like all these other Pokemon. And the story that, and I do think that even the story of Ho-Oh is still kind of lost in mystery, because while the Brass Tower, because it all started when the Brass Tower eventually burned down. You know, like they say in Ecruteak City, I believe is how you pronounce it. You know, they said that you could see the towers on both sides of the city. Like Ecruteak City was the Japanese town, where it was just a little bit north of Goldenrod City, but at the same time it was more kind of like a little northeast though. And eventually you'd go there, and it was like a very Asian town, very Japanese. You know, Ho-Oh would sit on the top and watch over things, and anytime it saw something, that it would go out and try to save the people, you know. And then you saw the same thing with Lugia. Lugia would sit on the Brass Tower and, you know, watch from another afar, and the both of them would just live and coexist in harmony, you know. And if people wanted to pay tribute to Lugia, you know, aside from the shrine protectors, they had to climb the tower, and eventually they'd be presented with, you know, seeing Ho-Oh. You had a giant Chinese chicken and a giant, I don't know what Lugia was supposed to be, what kind of Pokemon that was supposed to be. But they were basically Japanese gods, basically. Giant creatures that harvest power. They weren't dragons, but they were birds, though. And they had the ability of water, psychic powers, and fire, basically. Kind of like a yin and yang, but not a yin and yang. Not like Reshi and Zekrom, but like in Reshi, Ranma, and Zekrom. And then they were looking for their own counterparts, you know, trying to find like who they eventually belong to. Because that's what a lot of Pokemon is, though. it basically, as far as its lore goes, it's a lot of Japanese Asian mythology, mostly Japanese though. Some of it can be Chinese too, because China, from what I understand, is like its oldest dynasty. But that's where they get a lot of this stuff from though, if you're very curious. A lot of the history of Pokemon does come from like a lot of lost Asian mythology, and it is very interesting indeed how far back it goes. It seems like there's a rabbit hole of a rabbit hole when you really start digging into it. Whether it's the lost history of like the Pokemon story itself or the history it's based on, and you really got to keep digging into it, and you start finding a lot of other things that you didn't think you'd find. So that's why we make these videos, try to talk about it. Because a lot of people have played Pokemon, but there's a lot of things about Pokemon a lot of people don't know, coincidentally. And I'll keep saying it because, you know, I mean, I know people like Dr. Lava still make these videos, but at the same time, though, I want to keep making them too, because for a series that I love, you know, I eventually do find stuff that I don't think a lot of people know about. So I figured, well, you know, I might as well share it with everybody. So... yeah, the story of Lugia is an interesting one. Its lost history is even more interesting and puzzling. But it's even more bizarre because it makes me wonder, you know, how much story, like if Lugia really was supposed to be designed in Gen 1, would its story have been much different? Or what would it have said about Gen 1's creation if they could have put Gen 2 and Gen 1 if they didn't run out of cartridge space? Is it possible that maybe they never would have made the other games then, even if the games would have sold so well, because maybe they've already had the ideas that they've already wanted to put in? Or maybe they decided they probably would have kept making Pokemon games because it was something they loved to do at the time, you know? Again, Satoshi Tajiri did state that they didn't want to create a series that people loved. And I mean, even before he started developing Gen 1, he already put like 1,000 hours into it. It was like crazy. Something absolutely mind-blowing, man. Like it had to have been something he loved. If it wasn't, then it would have been a real stressful time for them if they couldn't have figured this stuff out when they did. And the funding wasn't there at the time, but they eventually got Shigeru Miyamoto on board with it because, you know, he looked at what they had, and, you know, for some reason Shigeru Miyamoto was able to see it as, like, before it was even an idea, like they still looked at it and he just thought, you know, that would work. And everybody else probably didn't see it at first, but eventually he saw through that, and, you know, he was able to convince a lot of people. So it was thanks to him they were able to get the funding, and they were able to finally make the games that they did because they had already introduced a lot of success before. So, you know, that's what had happened. So I do feel like, you know, that's why Game Freak was able to pull off what they did when they did. And still, even that, a lot of history is lost within like 25, 30 years. Because Pokemon first, I mean, if we really think about it, the lost history of Pokemon, it goes back to like 1989 as Kapu monsters, and there's still so many things about it that we don't know. Whether it was, you know, beta designs or just a lot of interesting concept arts that we could try to get our hands on one way or another. But it is really interesting just as a series how much trouble somebody's willing to go through because they really have that willpower too. So again, it does make me think though, you know, going back to the towers that they burned down. If the brass tower never would have burned down in Pokemon, you know, would we have been able to go there and see Lugia? Would Ho-Oh have been there too on the other side? Could you also have seen Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno have been in the Johto region too, rather than just in the Kanto region? Or would we have to go get them in the Kanto region, bring them to the Johto region, and therefore they would be able to finally, you know, a lot of the stories would make a lot more sense. So then Ecruteak City would probably be like, not just the 4th gym, but we would be coming back to it many times, not just as a pass by or as like to go to some of the towns and cities though.